The point of this tape is to try and give you some insight into how to analyse adjourned positions accurately. And I've taken an example from my own play. If you look at the position in diagram 1, you'll see an endgame, and I had the black pieces against the Irish player Eamon Keogh, and this is actually a position that occurred at the second adjournment. And as you can see, white is in check, and it's white to move. Now, white actually sealed a move in this position, so what I suggest you do is to set up the position on a board and start to analyse it. And you start off playing the white side, and first of all try and predict what white's sealed move was. There's a choice of 5 king moves, and well, see how you get on, and switch off the tape while you're analysing. Well, it's possible to eliminate 2 possible sealed moves quite quickly. The king cannot move forwards. Now, if you didn't notice this fact, try and work out for yourself why the king cannot move forwards. Firstly, if king to g3, then black plays rook g2 check. The king must go to f4. Black plays f2, and he cannot be prevented from queening with check, which is decisive. Okay, now back to diagram 1 again. And try to move the king forwards the other way, king to e3. This is slightly more complicated, but not much. Here black simply pushes f2. Now it's no use white trying to queen, so he must stop the pawn with rook to f8. And now comes knight to f5 check, and black makes a queen. Okay, so back to diagram 1 again, and now we are left with a choice of 3 king moves, to g1, f1 or e1. So if you didn't realise that the king could not go forwards, have a look at the position again, and I warn you, it's quite complicated. Okay, well, let's start with the middle move, and that is king to f1. Now the best move against king to f1 is rook takes h2. If you didn't consider this move, then switch off the cassette and work out what it's all about. Now, the point of rook takes h2 is the following. If white makes a queen, c8 equals queen, then black simply takes it, knight takes c8, rook takes c8, and pushes g3. Now black threatens mate, and he's also threatening to promote his pawns if the white king goes away. And in fact, the pawn simply cannot be stopped. The only chance is king to e1, and then black gives a check, rook h1 check, king must go to d2, and black pushes f2, and he makes queen or wins a rook. So go back to the position given in diagram 2, which is the position after the move rook takes h2 by black. Now, of course, there's a second possibility. White need not make a queen first, but he can pin the knight with rook to d8, threatening to make a queen. Again, of course, black pushes g3, threatening mate, and we see that again white is too slow. If he runs away with the king, again black is going to make a queen, and the only other thing he can try is bishop to b6, but of course after rook h1 check, bishop to g1, f2, black wins easily. Of course, it's important to notice that the white can never make a queen with check. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning now, to diagram 1. And we have abandoned the move king f1 because of rook takes h2. So, did any of you consider the move king to e1? Well, king e1 is a very interesting move. So, if you haven't considered the move, go away and analyze it, and analyze it for a long time, because it has some very interesting variations and it's very complicated. Well, the first point about the move king e1 is that you can no longer play rook takes h2. Because white can reply, well, firstly with rook to d8, and now the fact that the move g3 no longer threatens mate is very important, and it's difficult. Well, the white pawn cannot be stopped from queening, because if black comes back with rook c2 to try and stop the pawn from queening, then white simply plays bishop b4, and he's going to win the knight, and certainly black has no chances of winning the game, and he may even lose it. So again, back to diagram 3, which is the position after king e1. So the idea of rook takes h2 doesn't work. However, there are lots of very interesting ideas. First of all, have you considered the following idea? Black plays f2 check. The white king must go to f1, and now black plays knight c4. Now, if you haven't considered this idea, again, I advise you to switch off the cassette and analyze it. The point is that if white makes a queen, then black has knight e3 mate. Well, the idea looks very promising. Unfortunately, white can put a spanner in the works. He plays after the move knight c4, rook d8 check, black king goes to e4, and now he has the unfortunate move bishop d2. This move is something of a problem, because if knight takes d2 check, white replies rook takes d2. Now black must play rook takes c7, else white makes a queen. And now white plays king takes f2 with a drawn rook and pawn ending. And by the way, if you go back to the position after bishop d2, you will see that if you try rook takes d2 instead, now white cannot queen because knight e3 is still mate, but he simply plays rook takes d2, knight takes d2 check, king takes f2, and whoops, you can't stop the pawn. So let's go back to diagram 3 again. We see that the move f2 check doesn't work. However, we can try to refine the idea. Did you consider playing the move g3 first? Now, of course, this must be taken because black has many threats. And now we play f2 check. Again, the white king must go to f1. And now black can play knight f5. And here we see the point of playing g3 first. He's not only threatening knight e3 check, mate, but he's threatening knight takes g3 check, which makes a queen with check. So now white has 2 threats to stop. Well, how does he do that? Well, the answer is the following. Rook to d8 check. Black replies king e4. Now rook to d2 this time. Now rook takes d2. Again, white has no time to queen, so must recapture. Bishop takes d2. Now black plays king f3, threatening mate in 1. However, white has bishop f4, and he stops all the mates just in time, because if black plays e5, well, if the white pawn on the 6th rank, this move would win. Unfortunately, it's on the 7th rank. White makes a queen, and then if e takes f4, then white has many checks with the queen. So g3 doesn't work. Back to diagram 3 again. One more try. Let's try to move king e4, trying to mate white, because now the threat is f2 check, white king to f1, black king to f3, and now if white gives a check on f8, you have knight f5, and now if white makes a queen, c8 equals queen, you take it, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, and now knight e3 is mate. Okay, that's the idea. Back to diagram 3. Black plays king e4. Well, does it win? And the answer is no, because white replies bishop to b6. And this stops all the threats, and maybe black is worse in this position because, well, probably he can make a draw, but he's run out of steam completely. Okay, let's go back to diagram 3 again. King e1 seems to be posing a lot of problems. Maybe it's the best move. Well, black can win against the move king e1, but it's rather subtle, and it's based on the idea of playing king e4. So let's try and refine the idea of playing king e4 by doing the following. Black plays rook e2 check. Now, if the white king goes to f1, we have the same position as in diagram 2, black plays rook takes h2. So to avoid this, the white king must go to d1. Now, we move the rook away to a2, creating a pin. It also creates the threat of rook a1 check followed by f2, which would win. Therefore, and by the way, it also threatens to move simply f2. Therefore, the only defense for white is to come back with the king, king e1. Now we have the same position as in diagram 3, but with the black rook on a2 rather than c2. And this makes an important difference, because now let's try king e4. Now, if you remember before, that the only defense against king e4 was the move bishop b6, which is now impossible because the bishop is pinned. And so there's no defense against the threat of f2 check followed by king f3. The only possibility is c8 equals queen, but then knight takes c8, and black will come into a rook ending, which is an easy win. And, well, one more possibility. Instead of c8, white can try the move king f1, so that f2 is not check, and f2 can be met by c8 equals queen, because the rook ending will no longer be won, because the pawn on f2 will be undefended. However, black can win in a variety of ways against king f1. He can play rook takes h2, which leads to a position similar to diagram 2 again, or he can play the simple knight c4, because now there is no defense. The move bishop d2 no longer interferes because the bishop is pinned, so the only move is c8 equals queen. Black plays knight e3 check. The king cannot go to e1 because of rook e2 mates, so it must go to g1, and then comes f2 check and mate next move. Okay, so we have solved the problem of king to e1. So back to the initial position, diagram 1. We've got rid of the two forward moves of the king. We've got rid of king f1, we've got rid of king e1. So what about king g1? Well, study the position and see what you can come up with. Now we have some background knowledge based on the other variations. The position becomes a little easier to analyse, but it's still very difficult. So have a nice think about king g1. Okay, well, king g1 is the position in diagram 4, and as we have seen, the move f2 check, it doesn't work against king e1, and therefore it's not going to work against king g1. The same with the idea of playing g3 followed by f2 check. It's no better with the king on g1 than with the king on e1. So with these ideas not working, black's best chance is rook g2 check. Because now you'll notice that if the white king goes to f1, then black plays rook takes h2, and we get back to the position that occurs in many variations, our old friend diagram 2. So white king must go to h1. Now, as you can see, black can move his rook back along the 7th rank with tempo threatening mate, so he can improve the position of the rook. And in fact, black has a forced win from this position, which is quite long. So if you haven't seen this idea already, switch off and try and work it out. Well, the variation starts rook a2. And if you didn't see this move, try again. Of course, white must reply king g1. And now we continue rook a1 check. White king must go to f2. And now black plays knight e4 check. Again, if you didn't see this idea, then switch off, have a look at the position, see what's going on. Well, white's move is forced, king e3. Okay, you may ask, what's the difference between the black rook being on the A file and being on the C file as it is in the initial position? Well, the difference is that if the black rook is standing on c1 here, then black has no constructive move other than the move f2, to which white replies rook f8, and black has come to a total standstill, because if he makes a queen, white takes it, black cannot recapture, because then white will make a queen. So we have the position with the rook on a1. There's a vital difference. The move rook a3 check is possible, whereas with the rook on c1, the square c3 was not available. So rook a3 check. The reply king f4 is forced. Now black goes ahead with f2. Now again, if you haven't got this far in your analysis, you can switch off here and try and work out the rest. Well, if white makes a queen, then black will queen with check. So white first gives a check, rook d8 check, so as to draw the black knight out of play. Black must reply knight back to d6. Now, of course, it's important to notice that white can never make a queen with check. So he makes a queen. c8 equals queen. Now black's next move is easy. f1 equals queen check. Very important. Now the white king has only one move, king g5. Well, if you got this far, what's black's next move? And be careful, it's not obvious. Well, it's not as obvious as you might think. It would be wrong to give any more checks. If you played queen f5 check, white plays king h6, and you get nowhere. You get a draw, but you get nothing more. The correct move in this position is rook takes the bishop on a5. And the reason for not giving a check first is very important. The point is that now you may think, well, white has a lot of checks. But that's not true at all. The whole point is that white only has one check because the black rook and the white king are on the same rank. And as soon as white gives a check, black can move his king with check. So, for example, in this position, the move queen b7 check would be met by king c4 check, winning the queen. Very important point. So, in this position, white is lost, and I give the finish of the game because this is actually the game continuation, and I give the finish of the game because it was quite amusing. White tried the desperation move, rook f8. Now, of course, black can win a piece by simply playing knight takes the queen on c8, and white takes the queen on f1. However, black has something stronger, which you may try and find if you feel that way inclined. And the answer is black plays king d4, check. White must play king h6, the only move not to give black a queen check. And now comes the nice move, rook h5 check. And here white resigns, because after king takes rook on h5, black has queen b5 check, and the next move is knight takes queen. Okay, great. So we've solved the ending. This is how the game finished. And that's the end. But unfortunately it's not. You may remember that we've referred to the position in diagram 2 many times. So let's go back to diagram 2. Now, in this position, if you remember, I gave the line rook takes h2, and black wins because his next move will be g3. And you believe me. Okay, well, since you believe me, you now take the black pieces, and I take the white ones. What do you play after the white move, rook to g8? Well, this stops the move g3, and the first and most obvious reply is, well, I can take a pawn defending my pawn. I play rook takes h4, defending my pawn, and again, if you make a queen, I take it and I play g3, and if you move your rook away, I play g3. However, I'm white, and now I play king g1. And what do you play now? And the answer is that it's not easy for black to find a move. The white threat is rook d8, which makes a queen, and very difficult to find a defense for black. So let's go back to diagram 2 again. And white plays rook g8. So what do you play with black now? And the answer is as follows. The best move here is rook to c2. If you didn't consider this move, switch off, try and work out what's going on. Well, obviously white replies rook takes c4. Sorry, rook takes g4. And now black plays knight c4, a very strong move. If you didn't consider this move, again, switch off, try and work out what's going on. Well, the first point is that white cannot make a queen here. If white makes a queen, then black plays knight e3 check. The king cannot go to e1 because rook e2 is mate, so it must go to g1. Now black plays f2 check and wins. Okay, so go back to the position after knight c4. We see that black has two threats. Black threatens knight takes the bishop on a5 and knight to e3 check, which wins the rook and queens a pawn and does many things. So try and find a defense for white. Well, probably there are two possible defenses. If you're good at endgames, you'll realize that the position after the move rook takes c4, black replies rook takes c4, and, well, I won't go into this endgame in detail, but try finding a win for black in this endgame. It's not easy. The problem is that white pushes the h-pawn. However, the endgame is won, and I'll leave that to you to work out. So, assuming that white doesn't play rook takes c4, there is another defense. And obviously he must get the rook out the way, so we start with a check. Rook g5 check. Black replies king e4. Now there's only one move, and that is bishop to e1. This gets the bishop out the way and guards the critical f2 square. Now black plays knight e3 check. King g1 is forced. And at last you can get rid of this terrible pawn on c7. Rook takes c7. And this is probably a win for black. There's no point analysing any further. You can't analyse all adjourned positions to the end. But this is the best that black can get. One final try from diagram 2. We're not quite finished yet. Well, since it transpired that white had the move rook g8, stopping g3. What about trying the other move that stops g3, and that is rook f8? Well, again, black must be careful. The best, well, think about the position and see what you come up with. Well, the best move here for black is rook c2 again. The white pawn must be stopped from queening. Now, of course, the problem is that white starts pushing his h-pawn, h5. However, now black can advance his own king, king e4. And after the move h6, black plays g3, and his pawns are in time this time. Well, that just about concludes the endgame. As you can see, although it consists of concrete forced variations, it's by no means easy to analyze. Doubtless on your own you found a lot of variations which I haven't given in the tape. However, they probably do not work. When I analysed this position myself, I was led up the garden path by the position many times. However, I would like to point out that this is one of the easier types of positions to analyse because the variations are forced. And when you try to analyse adjourned positions which don't have forced variations, it becomes much more difficult.
The remainder of this tape will be read by me, that is Michael Basman, in the absence of Michael Stean. Now I'd like you to turn to position A in the booklet and set it up on your board. This is another position from actual adjournment, and I'd like you to spend some time analysing it as if it were a real adjournment. I'd say maybe a couple of hours at least before you switch this tape back on. Well, this is a position which will test your resourcefulness in unusual situations. As you can see, black has got a very good attack with his knight and rook, and unfortunately so has white. Also, most important, black's knight on f4 is under attack. It hasn't really got anywhere to go. Therefore, black is unable to play the move he wants to play, which is rook to h1, threatening rook to h8, which threatens rook to h1 mate, because white would simply answer with well, either queen takes f4 or rook takes f4. Therefore, your next move for black is more or less forced, and it is pawn to e5. There seems to be no other way to save the knight. Now, if you've done some analysis on this position, we'll carry on. If not, I'd like you to switch off and consider the consequences of both white pawn takes e5 and secondly white pawn takes f5. Now the first one we're going to deal with is pawn takes f5. Now black can here once again try the move rook to h8, which does have this mate threat. However, it doesn't look very good if white continues with pawn takes g6 check. White might then consider an immediate knight g3, or to play rook takes f4. Then if black plays pawn takes f4, queen to e8 is mate, of course, and if rook takes f4, probably white should not now take on e5 with his rook, because black has the answer, rook to g4 check, picking up his pawn at g6. Probably if white just goes knight to g3 here, and he's threatening rook takes e5. Now it's true that black can then, after knight g3, play pawn to e4, but white could take it off by rook takes d5, and black is in a perilous position with his king and his rook being threatened. White's threat immediately is probably rook e5. Now let's return to diagram A again, and we'll look at the possibilities once more. So returning to diagram A, after black pawn to e5, white pawn takes f5. Instead of going rook to h8, black could try pawn to e4. Point of this move is that the rook on h4 at this point guards the knight on f4, so this move is legal. Now white may try pawn takes g6 check, and the black king has to find the square. King goes to f6. That's the best move, and I think it wins. The point is that black is threatening things like rook to h8 at this point, and also the rook on g5. Let's look at a variation here. White plays rook takes d5, trying to take advantage of the fact that both the knight on f4 is pinned and the pawn on e4 is pinned. Well, black will just answer with pawn takes rook on f3, ignoring the pin. White plays queen takes e8, and now black can go knight to e2 check, which requires white to part with his queen. Now let's return a few of those pieces. Black knight back to f4, white queen back to e3, black pawn back onto e4, and white rook back onto f3. Black rook back on e8, white rook back on g5, black pawn back on d5. Well, you might say that in this position white could just defend by playing rook from f3 to g3, guarding his rook at g5. But here, black rook from e8 to h8 is decisive, because white no longer has the move knight to g3, guarding against the mate threat at h1. So I think that analysis dispenses with the possibility of white playing pawn takes on f5. So let's return to that position, diagram A, adding the moves black pawn to e5. And instead of playing pawn takes f5, we'll play pawn takes e5. So, back to diagram A, after black's played pawn e5 and white's played pawn takes e5. Now black can choose here either to win the exchange by playing knight to e6, or to sacrifice his knight with queen takes pawn on e5. We'll look first at queen takes pawn on e5. How did you continue here as white? Best seems queen takes queen, rook takes queen, white rook takes on f4. And now a theme we've seen before, black king to f6, trying to capture that rook which is on g5. White goes rook to d4, and now if black takes the rook, white will play pawn to f4, check, re-forking against the rook on e5. Well, there doesn't seem to be any way for black to improve upon this line. That is, he ends up a piece behind. I mean, for example, if he goes rook down to e4, white could just play his pawn up to f4, and that looks strong enough. So it looks like we'll have to give up the move queen takes e5. Now let's return to diagram A. Once again, adding the move black pawn to e5 and white pawn takes e5. Now here we'll try the other move, knight to e6. Now, did you consider the consequences of this line? It gives white a terrific attack. If you'd like to, then switch off here and analyze the position again. After knight to e6, white sacrifices the exchange by pawn takes f5. Black plays knight takes rook on g5, white plays queen takes knight. We're reaching now the position in diagram B. In this position, black has a number of moves. He can go queen c4, or rook takes e5, or rook on e8 to h8. In my opinion, they all lose, and black's only move is to play rook to h6. Now, since white is threatened here by the move queen takes e5, he must push the pawn on with pawn to e6 check. And black has to move his king back to g8, because if he goes to f8, then white plays pawn takes pawn, discover check, of course. After king to g8, white is once more threatened with the prosaic elimination of his attack by pawn takes pawn, so he must push on, pawn to f6. Black now cannot take the pawn on f6 because he loses his rook at h6, and as he is threatened by pawn to f7 check, forking his rook and king, he must play rook takes e6. White moves pawn to f7 check, and black king to f8. Now white's obvious choice of move here is queen takes on d5, at which point it's very easy for black to get a lost position. So please switch off again here and defend for him. Now white was not only threatening queen takes rook. He also had the threat of queen to rook 8 check, of course. Now black has an interesting choice of moves. He can go to f6 with his rook, which at first sight looks very good. But this would run into the move rook to e3. And after, say, queen takes f7, or even rook, then after queen takes f7, queen to queen 8 will mate. Rook takes f7, queen to a8 will mate. So replace black's rook at e6 and white's at f3. And have the white queen on d5, black pawn on f7. Sorry, white pawn on f7. Let's try here for black, instead of rook f6, rook to d6. White here moves queen to e5, with the obvious threat of queen to e8 check. And now black must play queen to d8. This is the only move. Other moves would allow white to play queen takes g7 check and pawn equals queen check. But after black's move queen to d8, it seems that white cannot progress further, and black will gradually be able to take over the initiative. Well, how did you do with that position? Did you find it easy or hard, or some of it easy and some of it hard? It'd be useful for you if you look over your analysis and see which bits you succeeded in and which bits you didn't. After you've done that, we'll go over to position C, and in this position it is black to move. I'd like you to switch off and study this position for quite a long time, as it's quite a complex one, even though there aren't many bits on the board. Now we can see here that black is in some danger, quite considerable danger, because white is threatening just knight takes pawn check. And then if the king goes, say, to d8, then white can play maybe rook to h2, rook to a2, threatening to come down and mate. Now there's a way for black to draw, or at least get equality straight away, if he wishes for it. He can play rook to e1. Then white must play knight takes pawn check. Black can now go king to f7, attacking the knight. White pushes his pawn on to d7. Now here, black has got a choice of two moves. Which one would you choose? The first move to play, and the attractive one, is bishop takes d7. Then if white plays rook takes d7 check, black can play king takes on f6. He's okay. If on the other hand white plays knight takes d7, then surely black can play rook to e2 check. White must play rook takes rook, and black pawn takes rook. Unfortunately, this is not the case, because then white can move his knight to e5 check and back to d3, and he stops the pawn from queening and will thus win the game. So let's return to the position in diagram C. And we'll look again at the variation where black plays rook to e1, white knight takes f6 check, black king to f7, and white pawn to d7. Well, black should not take this pawn with his bishop. He should go rook to e2 check straight away. And after rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, white pawn equals queen, but so does black. At first sight, this looks very dangerous for black, because surely white is queen first, and now he can check the black king. But in fact, white's pieces are very insecure, particularly his knight on f6. And say if he goes queen to g8 check, then black can play king takes on f6. So white's best chance really is to play queen to d5 check, and say after king takes f6, he might either take the bishop on b5 or first give a few checks like on f5 and capture black's g pawn with check. But at any rate, the result of this game should be a draw. Now let us return again to diagram C. Though at first sight black's position looks rather dicey, doesn't mean that he cannot also try to play for a win here. Instead of playing rook to e1, he can try the move bishop to c6. Now this move is intriguing. If white plays knight takes f6 check, and black goes king to f7, and white plays pawn to d7, I wonder if you considered the next possibility for white. He can play rook to h1 check, and then if king takes rook, pawn down to f2 check, and then if the king moves say up to h2, black queens his pawn with a rather good looking position. Now after rook to h1 check, instead of taking the rook, seems that black can also play, white, instead of taking the rook, after rook h1 check, white could play king to g3, and then black would play possibly pawn down to h4 check, white king to f2, black rook to h2 check, white king to e3, black rook takes d2, white king takes d2. Well, what is the end result of this position? I think probably a white win, because if black tries pawn to f2, white could just bring his king up to e2. On the other hand, if black plays king to e7, let's see how that will go. White can now play king to e3, and black bishop takes d7, white knight takes d7, white king takes f3. He'll win this endgame with an outside pass pawn. Let's look at another possibility from position C. After bishop to c6, white could play knight takes f6 check, black king to d8. Now here, should white want to play something like pawn takes h5, seems he is in difficulty after black just goes pawn to f2. But what about pawn to b5? Then if pawn to f2, white could play pawn takes c6, and after rook to h1 check, maybe king to g3. Now if white queens to a queen, if black queens to a queen, white could play pawn to c7 check, king c8, pawn to d7 check, and in fact white is going to probably mate in this position, most definitely. Then again, if black queens to a knight check, winning white's rook, well, white could move down to g2, and though he loses his rook, he picks up black's rook. So that was another variation in this extremely complicated position. I should also mention that from position C, black has other moves at his disposal which you may have chosen instead of the strongest rook e1 or bishop c6. He could also try bishop down to e2, and this has the idea of answering white's knight takes f6 check, king d8, rook a2, which threatens a mate, with the drawing continuation rook to f2 check. But if black wishes for a draw, he can play rook to e1.